And now, here we are. We've come to the moment where the rubber meets the road when it comes to the Roman invasion of Britain. Yes, it's finally here. You've been waiting patiently. It's episode 10 now. We finally got to that point. Here we go. So, as Rome begins to look across the seas, and as probably the British population in especially the southeast looked from their vantage point, it must have been strange to see boats coming with their sails designed the way the Romans did en masse, because they would have been familiar with Roman ships before this, because obviously there'd been trade going on and Roman ships are generally normal, but the triremes and the quadremes of the Roman military would have looked different. They would have appeared different, and the amount of them definitely would have been different, because there's no way that you would have merchants and tradesmen coming across the ocean as they saw the English Channel in this kind of mass and this kind of numbers. So the question becomes, how soon were the British aware? How soon did they know? Well, we're about to discuss exactly what happened, as much as we have history and archaeology to back us up. So with that, let's kick it off. Welcome back to the Roman Britain podcast, episode 10, Ad Terras Incognitas. We've been building towards this episode for a long time. Across the previous episodes, we've traced the deep roots of what is about to happen. We've explored Iron Age Britain in all its complexity. We followed Caesar across the Channel and back. We watched the decades of trade, diplomacy, and client kingdoms that slowly drew Britain into the Roman orbit. And we studied the army that would one day make the crossing. We followed Claudius through his ascent to the position of emperor. And we've watched and read about all the sources that would cover this event, their perceptions, their biases, and especially how they presented history in their understanding of it. Obviously, all of these authors are essential for us, for without them, we have a very sparse understanding of what went on. So, as I've said before, we have to use what we have. So, with that being the case, this is the perspective we're going to give today. So, now we're here. It's the spring of 43 CE. A Roman army crosses the Channel and lands in Britain. What follows is not a simple conquest. It was a campaign of extraordinary complexity, shaped by geography, politics, divided loyalties, and the determined resistance of British tribal leaders. It ended not with the fall of a city, the death of a king, or some sort of major triumphal victory for the Romans over the British, in quotes, because the reality of it is there's no British here. There's a series of tribes, there's a series of ideas, a series of chiefs, kingdoms, all sorts of things to deal with. And none of them are necessarily allied together, although some are. And in many cases, they fought on their own and they fought together to resist. And so it's very difficult to say this is where it all ends, this is where it all begins, other than to say that the invasion happens, and then what happens afterward is the slow, plodding conquest of what becomes England and Wales, largely, in the years to come. And by the end of the century, will be conquered. Scotland will basically remain unconquered for many years during this period, although there's attempts by the Romans to try, and Ireland never is reached by a military force big enough to make record of it. So with that being all said, here we go. A brief, carefully staged visit by the emperor, a formal submission, and then a proclamation of a new province is what we get in this invasion. Our title for this episode, Ad Terras Ignotas, means to unknown shores. The phrase captures both the Roman sense of Britain at the edge of the world and the genuine uncertainty of what any army faces when it steps into a hostile ground for the first time. This episode will take the invasion step by step. It'll talk about the assembly, the crossing, the landing, the battles of the rivers, the advance to the Thames, and the arrival of Claudius. This will show, at least for that time period, that those British tribes actually submitted and actually sought peace with Rome. They would submit to Claudius. Claudius would then use that to achieve a triumph, obviously, and show his military abilities, even though none really ever exist. That is where we get to today, and so let's talk about it. By the early months of 43 CE, the Roman invasion force was taking shape on the Gallic coast. The broad outline comes from Cassius Dio. Detailed archaeology and supplementary evidence comes from inscriptions, military diplomas, and excavations on both sides of the channel. Together, they allow us to build a fairly detailed picture of what was preparing to cross the water. First of all, the invasion force was built around 4 legions. This was one of the better established facts of the campaign, supported by later inscriptions and deployment records. So on this, we know for a fact. The 2nd Legion Augusta, which later became one of the most important permanent garrisons in Britain, was based in the southwest and associated with the campaigns of Vespasian, who we'll talk about in detail in a later episode. The 9th Legion, Hispania, would later become infamous for its mysterious disappearance in the historical record and was part of the initial landing force. 14 Legion Gemina, sometimes called Gemina Martia Victrix, after later honors, also crossed with the invasion. And finally, we have the 20th Legion, Valeria Victrix, which would eventually be based at Deva, modern Chester, and these completed the forces arrayed against the British. Each legion in the early imperial period represented roughly 5,000 heavy infantry, with attached specialists, engineers, and support staff. 4 legions, therefore, meant something in the region of about 20,000 legionary soldiers. This, of course, does not cover the entire troops. This is just the Roman evidence. There's also the auxiliary troops, which generally were about equal number to the original legions. Cavalry from Gaul, Thrace, and Spain made up some of these auxiliary. Infantry from other provinces would also make it up, and crucially, archers from Syria would add yet another ability that the Roman legions themselves did not possess or did not use. Specialists brought tactical flexibility into a heavy legionary unit, which it could, of course, not provide on its own. The total force has been estimated anywhere between 40 to 50,000 men by any ancient standard. This was a major military commitment. And one of the reasons that we talk about this amount is simply because quite frequently in the ancient world, numbers were inflated. Battles that they fought would always have way more numbers than possible. I mean, even today, sometimes when we have field reports and battle reports, they inflate numbers or they don't understand what they're facing. And so people will say, oh, maybe they were facing 100 troops and suddenly it's 1,000, mostly because they don't realize what's on the other side, and the fog of war generally covers that. Also, it looks better on the report, especially if you've lost a battle, to say you lost to outstanding numbers than to say, oh, by the way, we were facing 100 people and there was 4,000 of us and we lost. Wouldn't look good, needless to say. But if you can say there was 15,000 of them and 4,000 of us, and, of course we lost, people generally understand better. So it kind of makes up for that. Now, I'm obviously exaggerating, but as you understand, this is kind of the way warfare works, the way it's reported. and it's something to be careful of, especially in the ancient world where numbers were quite frequently a little over inflated. That in this case, we have enough evidence to say this is probably a reliable report. Now, the man who was chosen to lead this force is Aulus Plautius. We discussed him briefly in a previous episode. He was not a household name in the manner of later commanders, and had held a consulship and had governed Pannonia. But that, of course, meant he was experienced, reliable, and critically loyal. That was something that somebody like Claudius needs, because you need someone who's not going to cause trouble, not going to be an obvious emperor in waiting sort of idea. So you want to, even though in this period it's still done via descendancy, that will end soon enough. And so you have this concern that a powerful general could turn on you. So one of the things you do is you make sure you have the right general, one who's good at his job, no doubt, but is pliable to your point of view and is going to be first and foremost loyal to the emperor. And again, he needed someone who could win and not use this victory to challenge his imperial authority, and that's what Plautius gave him. Cassius Dio describes Plautius as a senator of high repute. Ancient texts do not give us physical descriptions or detailed biographies. Quite frequently, that just wasn't what they were concerned about. They didn't care how people looked when they were talking about them, especially if they wanted to talk about them in a negative or positive way. They may not necessarily always describe them clearly, and even if they did, it's not necessarily true what they're describing. And unless you're in a position where we have evidence of their facial features due to, coins being minted or busts being made, you just don't always know. And even those obviously are going to be stylized and idealistic, so there may be blemishes or problems in their appearance that get taken out to kind of buff them. And I think that's something we have to be mindful of. His handling of the campaign itself, which we can partially reconstruct, suggests a commander who combined methodical planning with the ability to improvise when circumstances required. One detail from Cassius Dio is particularly revealing. When troops initially refused to embark, it was the freedman Narcissus, Claudius's secretary, who addressed the army on the emperor's behalf. Seems like an odd idea, and came across as an odd idea. The soldiers mocked him, shouted the festival cry of Io Saturnalia, a joke about a slave playing the role of a freedman, something that would be mocked, obviously was done for mockery. But what the mockery did was it broke the tension, and the army then laughed amongst themselves, yet obeyed the order in the long run. Plautius let this happen, as did Claudius. He did not insist on his own authority. He understood the troops needed that moment to diffuse their anxiety before they could be moved. This kind of tactical judgment about human nature was important, as was the tactical judgment on the battlefield. The commander has to understand his troops as well as the strategy and tactics you're going to use in a fight. It's important to understand that all the tactics in the world mean nothing if the troops can't execute it. If they don't have the morale to back them up, to make them effectively fight and murder other people, you need that level of morale to do that whole sense of unity in decision making and in movement. All of this is especially important in a Roman military setup, which is all based around unity, movement together, and formations that are tight and not broken easily. That cannot happen if your morale is easily broken. Quite frequently, when we look at battles, quite often what ends up happening is it's when the morale breaks that the troops fall apart and the battle gets turned on its head. So, key to both, right? And of course, Roman soldiers were not really easily frightened. They had fought across Germany, Gaul, and the Danube frontier, and Near East and North Africa. They were professionals who had seen more difficult campaigns, and this one was not really by nature that more difficult. But the reality of it was, for Romans, crossing the English Channel was perceived as crossing an ocean. It was perceived as entering the unknown, the here there be dragons level of the map. And so that could cause terror because of the distance, because of the uncertainty of the boats. And that in and of itself made it nerve-wracking. They also, the ocean was not just simply water in Roman thinking, it was a boundary. It was the edge of the inhabited world, and classical geography had placed the known world on one side and uncertainty on the other. The reality of it is, too, is if you believe that there is a god of water who can be vicious and vengeful, because water and oceans can be vicious and vengeful, and as anybody who knows anything about the English Channel would know, the channel itself is unstable at times. Crossing it can be quite disastrous if the weather turns against you. It's not always straightforward. And so, especially in a time of sail and a lack of any sort of compass and all of that, yes, you can see the other side on a good day, but the reality of it is you are stepping off into a land that is separated from you. And it like I said, it can be scary, it can be intimidating. And it definitely was for these men, obviously. It's not just a logistical act, it's a symbolic one, and the troops understood that. The hesitation, of course, was not cowardice. It was an expression of the same psychological weight that made Caesar's expeditions matter so much more as propaganda in the century earlier. As classicist James Romm has written on the Roman geographical imagination, the ocean in Roman thought was not merely a body of water, but a conceptual frontier, the place where the known world ended and the unknown began. For soldiers raised on that geography, crossing it was not simply a matter of a military movement, it was a transgression in the natural order, and they felt it. And you can understand that. Again, going back to what I said, you don't want to cross Neptune. And so you want to be very mindful of the fact that this god could overthrow you in a quite easy way. So, you do the right sacrifices, you offer the right inducements in order to convince the god to let you go. Luckily for the Romans in this time, Neptune was kind. The Channel crossing of 43 CE required a fleet of significant scale. Cassius Dio does not give us a precise number of ships, but the logistical movement of 40 to 50,000 men with their equipment, horses, artillery, and supplies across open water implies hundreds of vessels. The Roman navy in the northern waters operated primarily through Classis Germanica, the German fleet based in the Rhine. The fleet may have been supplemented with requisitioned civilian ships from the Gallic ports. Ancient shipbuilding archaeology from the Rhine Delta and other coastal Gaul areas give us some sense of the vessel types available. Flat-bottom transports capable of beaching were used alongside galleys to protect and to offer easier communication. The crossing itself appears to have been made in 3 divisions. Cassius Dio uses the Greek word for 3 groups or columns. This was almost certainly a practical decision. Moving the entire force in a single mass would have been logistically impossible. 3 waves allowed the fleet to be managed more efficiently and reduced the risk of catastrophic loss if weather deteriorated. Ancient sources are frustratingly vague about the precise departure point on the Gallic side. Most scholars have placed it at or near Vasoricum, modern-day Boulogne, which was the most logical embarkation point for a crossing to southern Britain, and was the base of the Classis Britannia in later decades. The crossing from Boulogne to Kentish coast takes a modern vessel several hours. For an ancient fleet carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, horses, supplies, spread across 3 waves, the crossing would have taken considerably longer. Wind and tide were critical variables. Ancient mariners had detailed knowledge of the channel conditions, but the crossing remained inherently unpredictable. Cassius Dio records that the crossing was initially delayed. The troops were moving towards ships and then held back, apparently waiting for a favorable condition. At some point, a shooting star was observed crossing the sky from the direction of Gaul towards Britain. This was interpreted as a favorable omen, and the fleet sailed. Omens being a very critical part of Roman thought process, they did a lot of things based on omens, and when there wasn't an easy omen to explain things, they would create them in the aftermath to say, oh, well, this is why this happened, because of course there was a bird that flew out of a bush, in front of so-and-so, and that's why it was all disaster or all success. It was clever in that respect. Whatever the actual astronomical event, the detail tells us that the army's mood needed managing right up to the moment of departure. Even after Narcissus's episode, the crossing was not simply a military operation, it was a psychological one. So, where did they land? Well, let's start off by looking at it from the Roman perspective. The first wave of ships ground on a shingle in the gray light of an early morning in spring of 43 CE. A legionary of the 20th Legion sits wedged between his pack and the man beside him. Around him are sounds of 2,000 years of soldiers landing on beaches that they did not choose. Groaning timbers shouted orders, the particular kind of fear that comes from not knowing what the far shore holds. He had heard about Britain. Everyone has. The stories go back to Caesar. People paint themselves blue. They use chariots. The tide is unpredictable. The fog comes without warning. The ramps drop. Cold water, shingle underfoot, and the weight of armor and pack and pillion and shield. He follows the man in front of him and tries not to fall. There is no one waiting for him on the beach. Just pale sand, low dunes, and the silence of a country that does not yet know what has arrived. And he will be there for 25 years. The question of where Claudius landed his army has been debated by scholars for a generation. It is one of the greatest unresolved problems of Roman-British archaeology. The traditional answer is the Kent coast, somewhere in the area of Richborough, known in Latin as Ritupiae. This was the most obvious landing point for the fleet crossing from Boulogne, and was the site of later Roman harbor works and a sustainable fort. The earliest Roman material at Richborough dates to around the right period and includes evidence of a large ditch system and consistent with military camps. However, in recent years, a significant alternative has emerged. Excavations at Pegwell Bay on the island of Thanet have uncovered evidence of a large temporary military camp with ditches and sling bullets dated to the mid-1st century BCE or CE. The site at Abbott's Fleet, with its area, had produced some of the most compelling direct evidence of a Roman military activity in the right period. It's possible that the landing was not a single event or even a single location, which might explain these divisions. A force of 40 to 50,000 men in 3 waves could have used multiple landing beaches across a stretch of the Thanet coastline. The ancient shoreline of this area was substantially different from today. Thanet was genuinely an island in this period, separated from the mainland by the Watson Channel, a navigable waterway that would have made the area strategically useful for landing forces. What archaeology cannot yet tell us is the exact sequence of the landing, the precise scale of British resistance on the beaches, or even if there was any. Cassius Dio says the British did not meet the Romans at the coast because they had expected the fleet to turn back again, as it had done under Caligula. This suggests that there was initial resistance, but that it was limited or at least absent at the landing point. Gerald Grange, whose close study of the invasion evidence remains important, noted that the dispersal of Roman forces across multiple landing points would have made any coordinated British response at the shore extremely difficult. The Britons could not defend every beach simultaneously. They really had not got the same level of coordination. They definitely did not have the same level of force and the level of unity needed to meet that force at the beach and drive it off. Claudius may have counted on exactly that when he assigned this strategy. So let's have a look at the British situation. Before following the army's advance, we need to remember where we are. Cunobelinus, the dominant king of the Catalveni and the Trinovantes, had died sometime in the late 30s or 40s CE. His sons, Tagodumnus and Caractacus, had continued his expansion policies. It was pressure from these two that likely included the expulsion of the pro-Roman ruler Verica from the Atrebates, and it gave Claudius his justification for the invasion. Remember, Rome loves to have an excuse. They don't like to do things purely under invasion for colonialism's sake. They want to make it look like they're the good guys, so at least amongst themselves and the propaganda they're telling themselves. So, of course, this helps. And of course, this is important because the Roman army is not landed on a united island. It is not entering something where allies and associates work together in great harmony, and thus you can develop a resistance to the landing. They are instead entering a fractured political landscape with many, many differing tribes and kingdoms, as I mentioned earlier. Some British tribes has reason to welcome, or at least not actively resist, the Romans. The Atrebates, for example, had been pro-Roman for generations. Their territory in the south had been disrupted by the Catalavenian expansion. A Roman presence might restore their position and thus not seen as hostile. Other tribes further from the Catalavenian zone, like the Iceni in Norfolk, for example, had no deep grievance against Rome and no particular reason to fight for someone else's kingdom. Keep in mind that the inner parts of Britain and the extreme west of Britain didn't really have a lot of contact with the Romans at this stage, so they wouldn't even necessarily even know they existed or knew what they were dealing with. All of this, of course, again, going back to how divided Britain was at this point in time. Then there are the Catalaveni themselves and their allies. They were the primary opponents, led by Tagodumnus and Caractacus. They were the strongest military force in southern Britain, and they were directly in the path of any Roman advance. For example, there is theories, although I don't know if there's loads of evidence, that Londinium, or London, obviously, was originally a place of operations for these tribes that eventually becomes taken by Rome, who saw the value of the area. John Crichton, in his study of the creation of the Roman province, put this well when he argued that Rome did not conquer a country in 43 CE. It conquered a set of relationships. Some of those relationships were already Roman in all but name, and it simply formalized them. Others had to be broken by force before they could be replaced. All that said, all that done, thank you all for listening or viewing today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can also reach out to me on social media, usually at Welsh History Pod, or if you like, on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And we are on Patreon, and you can visit there at patreon.com/Welsh History. I have just recently put up an episode on the end of the Hadrian's Wall in my tour around an area of Newcastle. It's very fun, and I hope everybody who is checking it out is enjoying it. We will be doing one on Caerleon very soon, probably in the next few weeks. So look forward to that if you are a Patreon subscriber or supporter. Keep in mind you can always sign up, and anybody at any level beyond the free level gets access to this kind of stuff. So it's really valuable to me to have you all there, but it also, I think, I'm hoping to support and give more items that are of interest, and especially when we're talking about Britain at this stage. And I'm looking forward to continuing those processes and discussions. So with all that said and done, have yourselves a great day. We'll talk to you later. Terras. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.